Welcome to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. Like any good marriage, we will debate, evaluate, and sometimes quarrel about how privacy and security impact business in the 21st century.
Hi, Jody Daniels here. I'm the founder and CEO of Red Clover Advisors, a certified women's privacy consultancy. I'm a privacy consultant and certified informational privacy professional, and I provide practical privacy advice to overwhelmed companies.
Hello, Justin Daniels here. I am passionate about helping companies solve complex cyber and privacy challenges during the life cycle of their business. I am the cyber quarterback, helping clients design and implement cyber plans, as well as help them manage and recover from data breaches.
And this episode is brought to you by Red Clover Advisors, which is celebrating its 4 years in business this week. We help companies to comply with data privacy laws and establish customer trust so that they can grow and nurture integrity. We work with companies in a variety of fields, including technology, SaaS, e-commerce, media agencies, and professional and financial services. In short, we use data privacy to transform the way companies do business. Together, we're creating a future where there's greater trust between companies and consumers. To learn more, visit redcloveradvisors.com. Justin, who's with us today?
I think we're going to talk about public relations today. Jody, how much do you enjoy being your own publicist?
It's lots of fun. I get to do all kinds of really interesting things. Who is our special guest?
Today we have Dave Oates, who is a crisis PR specialist focused on a wide variety of events for any type of organization. These include mass layoffs, product recalls, employee misconduct, and of course, cybersecurity breaches. Hello, David.
It's good to see you. Happy summer. I hope you're staying cool.
I guess it is still summer. See, our kids are in school, so it doesn't feel like summer. It feels like back to school, and I associate back to school with fall. But I suppose it is 90 degrees outside and technically summertime.
I was going to say, especially where you guys are based, the heat and humidity should tell you that what season you're in. And It is definitely summer.
Yeah. So for those listening, you can't actually see my hair, but can't you tell it's like total human here? Well, Dave, it's great to have you. And, you do a variety of PR response. We're really going to focus in on our data breach response here. Mm-hmm. But before we do that, it's always helpful to know how you got started. Tell us a little bit about Dave and your career and how you got to talking to us about data breach response today.
It's the most backwards way I think you would expect a publicist, a PR person to get into the business. I was a Navy officer. Specifically a surface warfare specialist. And I guess it was about a year and a half into my first ship tour as the anti-submarine warfare officer. Junior officers get these collateral side duties. Mine was public affairs. So my job originally was to promote the ship when we'd be in ports of call, setting up tours, writing articles for the local Navy publications, but also engaging press and other entities, telling them what we were doing. And you have one of those aha moments as a young person. For me, it happened in my mid-20s where you realize this is the kind of thing that I'd like to do. And I wanted to figure out how to do it as a career. Turns out that the Navy had 200 officers at the time that did public relations, public affairs as their primary duty. And so through some mentorship and some inquiries and a lot of perseverance, I was accepted into the community through the bureaucratic lateral transfer package, went to a 2-month immersion school at Fort Meade, Maryland, and became, for the latter half of my 9-year career, a full-time Navy public affairs officer. And as you can imagine, being in the Navy and forward deployed, crisis is just part of the job. I dealt with everything when I was on board an aircraft carrier for a couple of years, from, unfortunately, accidents involving sailors, some fatal. I had activities that would occur in ports of call. We were in hot war environments and all points in between. And then when I went into the private sector about 20 years ago, and specifically hung on my own shingle about 15 years ago, I was known as the guy who had seen a lot of different crisis events And that evolved into basically focusing on that full time about 4 years ago. And I honestly, I wish I had done it probably 10 years before that. It's been a really great ride. I love being in a position where I can help provide organizations and individuals and executives the ability to get through a situation and develop a communications plan that allows them to get back to normal operations. It's truly a privilege.
Well, it was a really interesting journey. I did not know that you were in the Navy. So I would, I'm sure there's and you as a history buff, you two can have all kinds of fun sidebar conversations.
Yes, hunting submarines is serious business.
The old adage they taught us first thing in anti-submarine warfare school, because you're on a surface ship, right, is you have to fight it with multiple assets because the math doesn't work otherwise. One ship plus one submarine equals one submarine. And so you have to rely on aircraft and other ships and hopefully your submarines to triangulate and get to that.
Yeah, I'm thinking if you were in your former role now, particularly with what's happened in the news with the pullout from Afghanistan, that is something that would be PR crisis might be an understatement.
There will be a blog posted this week as we make this recording where I talk about the 48-hour gap in communications by the Oval Office that has led to the crisis of confidence that we're seeing. Not necessarily talking about the military operations, but there was a 48-hour of essentially, for all intents and purposes, silence. And that led to now a questioning of all the things leading up to the pullout of it, right? Not just the pullout.
And that is a perfect segue into my first question, sure. Which is, and you and I are working on an ebook together, but right. To what you just discussed, help me frame this for the audience. So we're in the middle of a ransomware event, forensics, we're still figuring out.
Sure.
And legally, it's like, well, we need to, have the horses together, and we're concerned about legal liability. And of course, in the meantime, if we're telling customers silence, now what? So I want to turn with that question over to you to exactly in a ransomware context. What happens when we go radio silent with our customers because we'd rather say nothing than because we don't know?
Yeah, it's always the balance that organizations try to achieve is wanting to wait until they have something sort of substantial that they can say to audiences. But the problem is that if you don't do it, somebody else sets the narrative. In the case of a ransomware attack, your customers, your employees, your business partners are going to start chirping largely in a social media format, right? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. I can't get access to such and such organizations. I can't get to my customer portal. I can't get to I can't get to their website. I can't get to their products and services. Anybody know what's going on? And in absence of having a statement at the ready soon after the ransomware is detected and you're starting to engage, you will allow the speculation to run rampant, and that will increase the anxiety, which always turns to anger. Anxiety that gets unchecked by, an audience group will turn into anger because they feel voiceless. They feel disenfranchised. Now, to your point, what do you say if you don't know what's really going on? And you are always concerned, and rightfully so, of the legal liability. I'm of the opinion that you go to, and this is going to date me for some reason, for some is the Dragnet episode. Just talk about the facts. We've had a breach. Here's what we're working on right now. More information to follow. And I've got a couple examples that we can talk through on that one. You don't have to go into the speculation mode, but you have to let people know that you're on it, you're taking it seriously, and there's actions that is going on to at least give you some gap and some wiggle room to be able to actually go and engage the threat actor and continue with the forensic. Because if you don't, your customers are going to take you away from that, and it's going to be a bigger distraction, a bigger mess than you ever thought.
Because I guess a follow-up question I have to that is, I know a lot about PR from having conferences, but also because a lot of times when companies don't want to pay to engage you, by default, PR falls to me.
Right.
And I've had to prep people to go and talk to publications and tell them, let's not use the word ransomware. And of course, because they're not prepped, they don't have experience with it, the first thing they say is ransomware. And so talk to our audience a little bit about the specific value proposition of having someone like you come in as opposed to having Justin wear multiple hats.
First off, you are way too busy doing other things that are mission critical to restoring the network, engaging the threat actor, figuring out all of the entities from that to be the PR and marketing and spokesperson. So get a team first and foremost that's robust, that is trained in the specific areas that you will need to engage the threat. PR is certainly one of them. Legal, your IT, your insurance specialists, all of the risk managers, they are all going to come into play. And don't try to have one person wear multiple hats, because you don't have the time and you don't have the wherewithal to be able to do all that with one or two people. It just ain't going to happen. You and I probably disagree a little bit, I would say, Justin, in the term ransomware, and this is probably going to come out in the ebook, and I'm looking forward to it. If the public knows it's ransomware, and if the public already has it in the domain through social media posts that picked up by news media, and you don't say it, the organization is going to look silly, and the organization is going to look like they're not competent, and it will create greater anxiety and animosity. I certainly respect the fact that if it's not defined in the public domain already, that you certainly don't want to use it for all the reasons that you state. You're still working on the forensics. There's legal liability risk. There's impact in negotiations. But the example I was going to talk about is a big healthcare company here in Southern California called Scripps, where it was reported in multiple outlets and in social media. It was widely known that they were the victim of a pretty sophisticated ransomware attack. It took down their reservation systems for their patients for nearly a month. And it wasn't until 3.5 weeks into it that they used the term ransomware. All they said is that we've had a IT network event. And every time they were pressed by the news media, they stuck to that narrative. And it's still something that here we are months later, they're still reeling from, because patients will say, well, you know what? I think I'm going to move over to your competitors and all that. So I hope that gives you at least a little bit of flavor as to where my thinking is.
I'd love to bring us up speed a little bit and talk about planning. And you had even mentioned having a prepared statement, which could certainly be something that you're going to be preparing and planning during this situation. Justin and I always are speaking to incident response preparation and having the right firm in place and thinking through who are going to be the spokespeople and what you might say. And while the facts and the specifics will change, having some type of remote clue is going to make the process much easier and a bit less emotional. Can you share how you work with clients through that type of process and how that all plays out?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in planning for what you hope never happens. And ransomware cybersecurity breaches are now just a regular part of business. I know you guys know this. I'm preaching to the choir here. No matter the size and scale of the organization, everyone is going to be attacked, or at least certainly have the threat of attack. And so preparing for that needs to occur, because the time to figure out who's going to say what you will say, and to whom, and in what time frame isn't while the attack is occurring. That's just way too late, and you'll mess it up, and it won't go pretty, and you'll only create greater angst in the process. You need to prepare for it beforehand. So what we do is we'll prepare scenario plannings to understand, at least in general terms, what is it you're going to say, how you're going to express empathy for those that are impacted, and action to let them know that you're on it. Who will be your designated spokespersons, to which audiences, how you will then set up internally a process by which you can field inquiries, whether that's through your social media from the general public, specific to news media, or to your key partners who help you deliver your goods or services, to your investors, or if you're a nonprofit, to your key donors, to shareholders, other people like that. So people at least know what their role is. So if, God forbid, in this case, let's say a cyber breach or ransomware attack does occur, how do you get everybody together? Everybody at least understands the role. You massage the general messaging to conform with whatever it is you need to do now. Check with legal and execute, because you don't have all day to do this. You've got an hour. And another example I'll give you was Kaseya, a big, widely known IT services organization. When the ransomware occurred, within a few hours, they had the website up, the first statement out, social media engine underway, and they also had one-on-one communications with their MSP partners, and kept updating as it was occurring. And so you could tell that they had prepped for that one. So the yin to the yang, right? The healthcare organization versus Kaseya. Kaseya did a pretty good job, all things considered. And the healthcare company here in Southern California couldn't have done it worse.
Well, thank you. I know what we've done before, and I've participated in my corporate life, and now as an entrepreneur, in our businesses, we've even done simulations, because there's one thing to kind of write the scenario and have it on paper, but there's another to really discuss it and have kind of that tabletop discussion, because then you realize, when you read it aloud, maybe we want to say it a little bit differently, or we want to bring other people involved. Do you also do and encourage or maybe even just the feedback that you've had, lessons learned on any type of kind of tabletop simulation?
I think you have to train to the plan, right? Writing a plan is only as good as the people who understand what it is and how they're trained to it. And I am a big proponent of that. More to the point, I suggest to business leaders that you walk in the middle of the day and drop the scenario on your team members, calling it a drill. And this goes back to my Navy days. And see how everybody responds to it. I know it's a little disruptive to operations, but the reality is that's how the actual scenario is going to play out. It's not going to come at a good time. Everybody's going to be off doing their own thing. How do you get everybody back? The more you practice that, the less angst and anxiety you will feel, and certainly then all your key audiences when, God forbid, the real thing occurs. So I think that's exactly what organizations should do. The problem is that, I understand, at least in general terms, how, business leaders, executives, directors will say, well, look, I got these 5 fires today that are actually underway that I've got to address. And this one may occur, and I'm not exactly sure when, if, let alone if. So I'll put it on the back burner. But when that does occur, and it's a question of when, not if, it's going to be ugly. And you better understand what you're doing before it actually happens.
The one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was, so I've dealt with ransomware events that didn't have media coverage versus the ones that did. And the ones that did are an entirely different animal, because when the press is hounding you for statements and reaction, your ability to think shrinks drastically. And now it's coupled with ransomware variants that will now start calling your employees, pressuring them to, hey, why haven't you paid? Are you going to pay? And so I want you to give our audience a little bit of feel of what that's like when you're one of the ones where you are in the media public eye, and how that cadence of putting out press releases and responding that happens, and how it makes it so much harder.
It is, because the workload that requires exponentially greater. You will have to update media and subsequently to your employees, your clientele, your partners, and other stakeholders at a far greater frequency. Because once the news organizations get it, and to your point, Justin, they will get it not from you, they will get it from another source, right? They'll get it from, as I mentioned earlier, the social media chatter. Sometimes they'll get it from the ransomware threat actor trying to continue to push negotiations forward in their favor. And when that happens, you have got to start to get a rapid fire cadence. I would say consider every hour to start. You can always dial it back, but that's the kind of mentality you need to have in communications, all audience, including media. Because if you don't look like you're on it with empathetic, approaches that recognize the impact that this is having to people, and you don't give the assurances that at least you are doing all that you can, and you recognize the seriousness of it, this cascades, and it becomes just that much harder as the hours and the days go by, like that healthcare company. And I would caution everybody to not take that lightly. To your point earlier, Justin, some of those ransomware attacks don't make the public eye, right? And I will tell organizations, consider that dodging a bullet, meaning your plans and preparation should include how you will address news organizations and the general public because of social media chatter or something else. If it doesn't happen, fine. You don't have to necessarily jump the gun if it's not warranted. And we go through a scenario decision tree where we decide if we're going to go into active mode or respond to query, a passive mode. And you can change that on the fly, but you still should be prepared to answer the mail if it comes and answer it quickly.
I guess one other thing I wanted to ask just for your opinion is, obviously, the Colonial Pipeline CEO had to go to Congress and testify because that ransomware event impacted critical infrastructure. And what was telling to me was, Jody and I like to watch The Late Show with Stephen Colbert,
Yeah.
and he ran a little ditty about the testimony where you heard the CEO say, "Oh, our password was Colonial Pipeline 123." They didn't really have multi-factor authentication. And as you know, from what I understand from a lot of PR professionals, his testimony could have been handled a whole lot different from a company perspective. Love to get your thoughts around that.
Yeah, two things. Nowhere he was in an explanatory mode, but not an empathetic mode. He basically said, "Well, this is what we did, and that's just how it worked." Like, oh well, matter of fact. Maybe a little are bad, but there was no real, in my opinion, or at least the message got muted as to no real understanding about what they really were going to do moving forward. And you have to ask yourself too, if it was that, I don't know how else to put it, colossally stupid to have that kind of poor password management controls and security infrastructure. Granted, it was on their billing system, right? It wasn't the actual production, but knocking out the billing system meant they couldn't bill anybody, which meant the pipeline stopped moving, fossil fuels to the designated clients. Then you gotta fall on your sword a little bit. You gotta say this was absolutely unacceptable. Here are the things that we need to work on. Yeah, these were really stupid. Hindsight's beyond 2020, and we're gonna fix it. And nowhere in there, did that really play out. So, you're going to get what you get. And especially in that public spotlight in Congress where they are, politicians are looking for a scapegoat, right? They are looking to show their constituents, we're going to fight for you. And that just becomes such an easy target.
One of the, Colonial Pipeline was obviously front and center. You had mentioned Scripps was for like they was down for a month. Some of these can go on for a long time.
Right.
Where does the work of having someone, a lot of times people might think it's just at the beginning, it's just at the end, but some of these cases can go on for a long time.
Right.
So maybe share a little bit about how long I want to make sure that I have my favorite crisis PR person with me.
The rule of thumb, I say, the reason why you bring a crisis PR person on board is to convey a level of confidence that you can get back to normal operations as quick as possible, and that you will rectify any of the residual effects that have resulted from this event. So with that in mind, once you get back to at least a semblance close to normal operations and have an action plan that is conveyed appropriately and on how you will rectify any of the sort of residual effects from it, I would say that's about the time in which you can say, okay, you know what, we're going to keep this crisis PR specialist on call, but not necessarily engaged full time. There should be still regular check-ins as to how that remediation plan is going, or at least how you're moving forward on that. But you hire a crisis PR person to help communicate through something. You bring up a good point though, Jody, that I don't want to overlook. In the course of a crisis event, we will uncover fundamental flaws, and not maliciously intended. It could be just through ignorance, or certainly just everybody's got a blind spot on a particular portion of the operations of an organization, nonprofit or for-profit. It could be your customer service. It could be a product. It could be operational in building or delivering your products or services. It could be a HR related issue, or in this case, something fundamentally wrong with their IT infrastructure and security posture. I think it's important for organizations to take note on the value in bringing in other experts in those areas to fix those fundamental problems. I tell people, and somewhat jokingly, but with some degree of sincerity, I would prefer not to have any repeat customers. I would prefer you hire me one time to help communicate through the event, fix the fundamental issues, and then move on. If you hire me back within 6 months to a year to communicate a similar, if not exactly identical problem than you had beforehand, that's a big issue because you haven't done anything to sort of fix the fundamental problems that would prevent somebody like me coming in. Because as I get rehired, it becomes far less, the opportunities to give the organization some wiggle room to fix things becomes that much harder. You know, it's the fool me once, you know, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you kind of thing. And, you know, organizations, your stakeholders, your audiences are just going to go elsewhere.
So I want to ask a different question. I want to like metaphorically take my Jody wig and put it on and ask a PR question really in the privacy space. And what I mean by that is, for example, Facebook and some of the data collection practices of companies. So while we may not have a data breach, I still continue to see people whose data gets collected. They don't realize it's being collected. We've seen with Facebook and Google and the social media. And I wonder if you have some insight there as to how companies can put better PR around if we are collecting data and telling our customers how we're building trust and how PR might be helpful in turning privacy and security into a competitive advantage instead of a CYA activity in a ransomware data breach situation.
You know, and who I thought of, an organization that I thought has done a pretty good job about that and that communication level over the last month or two has been Apple. And it's been a competitive advantage. If you notice, they've actually been putting advertisements out in video on YouTube as well as on over the air, where they show how their iPhone users have the power to say, yes, you can follow me or you can access my data here or always or never. The power is in your hand, and we expressly state such so you can make a choice. Now, it hasn't necessarily been good for their relations with their other companies who use their who put apps on their phones and things like that. But the reality is that they've done a really good job to say you need to understand what you give up by way of your privacy and by way of your personal information when you use our devices or the apps within the devices. And I thought that was very, very good. Look, let's be clear about this, right? Most people willingly give up a lot of private information for the convenience of Amazon, quote unquote, knowing exactly what we want. I mean, how many people have Alexa, Amazon Echo in their house that collects data all the time, whether you talk to Alexa or not, right? They do so willingly for the convenience of it. And that seems to be fine by them. But I think Apple and others can do well by expressly stating this is what happens when, and you have a choice, not just through the terms and conditions that everybody just scrolls right through and hits accept, but in real engaging type of ways. So I use that as a good example.
Well, you really shared a lot of very fascinating and interesting information. I think it's so important because oftentimes people forget how critical the communication piece is. And I like how you've highlighted a story where they might not have planned. Time has gone on compared to a story where obviously they had a thoughtful plan put in place and were able to execute it really, really quickly. Do you see a difference between big companies and small companies? Is one might say, well, they're smaller companies more nimble, but then they might have more fires. And so they're not paying attention to it as much. The big companies, maybe they think someone else is doing it. Would just be kind of curious to see, do you see any nuances between the size or the type of organization?
I wish I could tell you there was, because, it would seem logic would tell you that there would be, right? Bigger companies would take it more seriously, have more protocols in place, have more systems, more processes, and also an infrastructure where they have a great communications group internally to do so. Whereas a small company just would say, look, we're limited in our resources. We don't, how big, maybe falsely thinking that they're sort of under the radar of cyber attackers, ransomware attackers, threat actors, that kind of thing. The reality is that I've seen as many missteps from large organizations I've worked with as I have smaller entities. And there really doesn't seem to be any difference in that. So all I can tell you is, from my standpoint, I think it is still a problem of not recognizing the severity of the risk involved when it comes to cyber breaches. And that needs to change quickly. And we've been talking largely from a business standpoint, but you mentioned my Navy background as we talked about it. This is a national security threat. This is where the next front line is. And so I think government, as well as for-profit and nonprofit organizations, state, city, municipalities, everybody needs to recognize this is real. This is detrimental to, if enacted upon, to our existence. In some cases, in our, from our infrastructure and our quality of life, and we need to take it more seriously as a people.
Completely agree.
So, changing to a bit of a more personal level, thought you could share with our audience, what do you think your best cyber tip would be?
I'm a huge believer in two-factor authentication, particularly when it comes to my bank accounts and to my investment accounts, right? But really, I do it from everything like that. If I'm logging in on my laptop or my tablet, I get a notification on another device that says, is this really you? Here's the code to put in there just to be sure. That to me is one of the big ones. If you tell me I had to pick one, that would be the one, two-factor authentication.
Well, it's a very popular one on our podcast. Many guests pick that one. And I have to say, talking to a crisis guy, that a lot of times companies forget two-factor on their social accounts. And I can't tell you how many times I see companies have their accounts taken over because they don't have 2FA. Especially in time of a crisis, that's one to double check. Are all of your social accounts, because you want to control that message. You don't want someone else doing so.
Well,
how many times? I'm sorry, I was going to say at least once a week I get a friend of mine who friends me on Facebook that I've been friends with for years, right? That just has their account hijacked. Yep.
I was going to add, then both of you can go like my post today on LinkedIn, which is no MFA, no deal. Why don't all companies require anyone they do business with that you either have MFA or there's no deal? Because the reality is you're not getting cyber insurance these days if you don't use MFA. The market is not going to insure you.
I will look that up because I'm 100% in agreement with you, sir.
Now, when you're not doing privacy, security, and crisis PR, what do you like to do for fun?
Oh, man, my wife and I have a ton of activities. We love hiking. We're both foodies, and we do what we're told not to do, right? Invite people over and try new recipes. You're supposed to test the recipes before we try them on people. No, we just like it. And we're like, look, worst case scenario, we're ordering pizza from down the street. That's just how it's going to work. So we love to do that. And I'm a diehard Padres fan. And I got to tell you, the last 2 weeks has caused me great agita as I'm watching our pitching staff just completely implode. And now we've got running the risk of not having the wild card spot in the playoffs. I am going to the game. As we record this, I'm going to the game tomorrow because the experience, if you haven't been to San Diego's Petco Park, it's great. But let's say my expectations are starting to wane.
Super fun. Well, Dave, how can people connect with you and learn more about you and what you do in the world of crisis PR?
The website's probably the best way, at publicrelationssecurity.com. But I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. You can catch me, Dave Oates, Crisis PR. You'll find me, and I'll look forward to connecting with you. Hey, I appreciate the time, guys. This has been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the She Said Privacy, He Said Security podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes and check us out on LinkedIn. See you next time.